With the summer around the corner, Mark decided it was time to finally start his DIY project in the garden. After digging for a few days, Mark felt a hard object touching the end of his shovel. He started digging more and unearthed a giant object, but at first he was unsure what it was. Mark decided to sleep on it overnight. But in the middle of the night, Mark woke up with a start and suddenly realized what it really was, and he called the police immediately to explain that he needed their help ASAP. But what did Mark find on his property? Why did the police get involved, and why was Mark not supposed to see this thing? But before we start our story, smash the like button, make sure to subscribe and hit the notifications bell so you won't miss any new stories. Mark's wife Patricia had been on his ass about finally getting a pool in the garden for nearly 5 years by now. It was a promise that he had made when they bought the house, but one that he had not yet delivered. They were not going on vacation this summer, and thus he had a lot of free time this year. He hoped he would be able to finish it in about 3 weeks. But Mark would quickly run into some unexpected problems that he could not solve himself. The first step in making the pool was to dig out the hole in the garden. Because he did not want to spend too much money on the project, Mark decided to take this upon himself with the help of his 2 sons, Toby and Brian. On the second day of digging, Mark had almost gotten the hole to the depth he intended. However, he feared the worst when his shovel suddenly hit something and sounded different than wood. Could he have hit some of the plumbing under the property? He had checked the documentation beforehand, which said that any plumbing and electricity should be at least half a meter lower than this. In the next hour of him trying to dig out the metal obstacle, Mark quickly established that he was not dealing with pipes or anything like that. This object was much, much larger than that. Furthermore, he felt like he had not even scratched the surface of this find yet. The more they got to see the metal object, the less they understood what they were dealing with. None of them had seen anything like this before. The only way that Mark could describe it was that it looked like a giant rusted metal bullet. He considered telling somebody about his find, somebody who might know more about it, but he also knew this could come with some unwanted consequences. The metal object did not leave Mark's mind that evening. He tried just to fall asleep that night, but he quickly realized that his mind was still too busy thinking about the metal object, and thus he decided to do some research on it. He had already looked online for what it could be without any success, but had also thought of another way to investigate. He started going through the old documentation of the house to see where it was that they bought it from 5 years ago. He could not find much useful information about the man, but he managed to find an email address he could use. And so, with nothing to lose, he sent the man a quick message about his find. He hoped that the previous owner would respond to him by the next day, but Mark did not have to wait that long. Only 2 minutes later, Mark got a message back in his inbox. He was very surprised to get such a quick response, but even more surprised by the contents of the email. When reading it, he even felt a shiver go over his spine. He had not expected to hear this tonight. The email did not explain exactly what Mark was dealing with, but it did contain a very stern warning about the object. The man begged Mark to leave the object and bury it again. Mark was stunned by the response and immediately sent an email back to ask for clarification, but realized the email address had blocked him. But instead of listening to the warning of the previous owner, the interaction only made Mark more curious as wondered, "What the hell am I dealing with?" The very next morning, Mark decided to call the police and share his find with them. Their first reaction was one of disbelief. Eventually, Mark did manage to convince the officers to send somebody out to his house to come and check out his find. Soon after the police officer arrived at the house, Mark knew he would not get off easy here. The police officers were wary of Mark, suspecting that he was feigning ignorance about the mysterious object in his backyard. They doubted if he had actually had a conversation with the previous owner, as the email address had gone out of service. This proved not to be good for Mark. Mark was taken aback by this as he found himself unexpectedly being the one apprehended. He tried to call for Patricia, his wife, or 2 sons, but was swiftly taken away. As he was being taken away, one of the officers began to recite the Miranda rights that Mark had only ever heard in movies. "You have the right to remain silent." The words echoed in his head. This could not be happening, but it was as the door closed behind him with a final ominous click. After Mark was taken to the station, he found himself stuck in an interrogation room where across from him a detective sat. The gruff officer kept hammering Mark about where Mark had gotten such an unusual object and why he had stashed it there. Mark tried to tell him about the past owner, but the detective quickly dismissed that. Mark felt hopeless. He needed help, but little did he know that he would get more help than he bargained for. Mark made the decision to halt his own defense and would not utter another word until he had a lawyer present to guide him through this legal minefield. Though his interrogation had halted at his request, his family had not been sitting still as they took matters into their own hands. Mark and Patricia's house, once orderly, was now the center stage of an investigation of their own. A whirlwind of documents had scattered along the living room floor. However, they seemed to have hit the jackpot when they came across files that were around 11 years old. Hidden amongst those pages, the family found mention of a permit issued to the previous owner. It authorized him to turn over his yard in order to replace his deteriorating sewage pipes, which had caused a major leak disrupting the property's waste disposal system in the past. Was this the answer they had been looking for? The documentation revealed that the repair site coincided exactly with where the family planned to install their pool and where they discovered the large metallic object. The pieces were coming together, but one question remained. Why had the previous homeowner buried it? Fortunately, Mark's son Toby, a private investigator, decided to dig deeper. After extensive research, he located the former homeowner. But there was a complication. The man had moved across the state. Determined to uncover the truth, Toby and his brother Brian embarked on the 6-hour drive, leaving their mother behind with promises to prove their father's innocence. Meanwhile, Mark remained in the interrogation room, grappling with whether to share his suspicions. He feared that revealing his theory about the object might make him look more suspicious. His lawyer arrived, offering reassurance. There was no evidence linking Mark to burying the object. When Toby and Brian arrived at the old homeowner's residence, they found it deserted. The house appeared lived in, but no one answered. Unwilling to wait, Brian searched the yard, wondering if this property held more secrets. Then Toby found a shed. Upon opening it, his breath caught. He immediately snapped photos and called Brian over. The shed was packed with peculiar objects, but most notably, it contained multiple metal detectors. The former homeowner had clearly been a collector. Some of the objects bore a striking resemblance to the one found in their father's yard. But then they made a chilling discovery. Antique firearms lined the walls, and shelves contained remnants of old artillery. Among them were components of explosive devices. Realization struck. Their father's situation was entangled in something much darker than they had anticipated. Before they could notify the authorities, a voice stopped them. "What are you doing on my property?" Toby and Brian turned to see an elderly woman staring at them. Regaining composure, Toby stepped forward. "Forgive the intrusion, ma'am," he said. "I'm Tobias Wilson, a private investigator. Your husband is involved in a police investigation." The woman's face paled. "My husband?" she whispered. "John is a good man. He can clear up whatever misunderstanding brought you here." Seated in an armchair was an elderly man, presumably John, reading a newspaper. He looked up, surprised by the unexpected visitors. Toby introduced himself and asked if he could record their conversation. John agreed, unaware of where this discussion would lead. "John," Toby began carefully, "the new owner of your former home found an object buried in the backyard. Records indicate that you were responsible for either digging it up or burying it." John exhaled deeply, releasing years of unspoken secrets. "I had always hoped that the shadows of my past would remain hidden. I had even asked Mark to keep it a secret, but it appears that they have now finally come to the light." He glanced at Toby. "I know you were in my shed, which means you now know about my fondness for collecting old weaponry. Dolores never liked it. He gave a small laugh. But there was something I collected that even she never knew about. About 12 years ago, I got a tip about a deserted military exercise site near my old home. The area was off limits, but that didn't stop me. I wanted to add to my collection. The area was off limits, but that didn't stop me. I wanted to add to my collection. Then I stumbled upon it. A massive metallic beast. I couldn't bear to leave it behind. His voice grew softer. I took it. At first I stored it in my shed, but soon news spread of a missing piece of military equipment. The authorities began door-to-door searches. They claimed it was a public safety risk. Panic set in. I had to act fast. My garden was already torn up from plumbing work. As the workers closed the hole, I saw an opportunity to bury it. I thought if it stayed underground, I could move on with my life. He hesitated. I know I trespassed and stole from a military site, but I never meant harm. I was just afraid of the consequences. I had just become a grandfather. I wanted a quiet life. Toby, still piecing things together, asked, "If you wanted this secret buried, why move?" "Dolores and I wanted to be closer to family," John said. "But there was also unease. Every night I felt the weight of what lay beneath our garden. Each morning I feared the news would confirm my worst suspicions." Toby leaned in, recording device in hand. All these years, all this secrecy. "What do you believe you unearthed, John?" Silence filled the room. Then John answered, "I'm convinced it was a bomb. And not just any bomb, a massively destructive one. The relentless search, the military's urgency, they wouldn't have been so desperate if it was anything less significant." Toby and Brian exchanged glances, hoping John's confession would clear their father's name. The next morning, they played the recording for the officers handling their father's case. As John's words sank in, urgency filled the room. Authorities knew they had to recover the buried object immediately. Whether active or a dud, it was still a danger. Mark was released, reuniting with his wife and sons. Meanwhile, the military safely extracted the bomb from their yard. The ground, once disturbed by secrecy, seemed peaceful again. Months later, the backyard was alive once more. But this time, it was filled with laughter and splashing. Patricia's long-held dream of a pool had finally come true. Together, they celebrated the end of their journey,